What exactly makes Sauron a necromancer? What does necromancy even mean in Middle-earth? Is it always evil? Can other people do it? What are some examples? Are the barrow-wights created by necromancy? What about the dead marshes? What about orcs and werewolves and the Nazgûl? And what about the dead men of Dun Harrow? Did Aragorn perform necromancy when he called upon them to fight? Let's take a look at dark magic, the power of Sauron, and the nature of necromancy in Middle-earth. Maya, Govan, and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. A couple of months ago, I made a video all about Sauron the Necromancer, the Third Age from his perspective, and in that video I talked all about Sauron's actions and his movements and his motives as the Necromancer. But what I didn't really talk about at all was what it means to be a Necromancer. Like, what is necromancy? How does it work in Tolkien's writings? Well, before I get started on that, first I think there are two very important words that need to be defined. None of this is going to make any sense unless we pin down what exactly we mean by necromancy, and what exactly we mean by death within the lore of Middle-earth. And I'll start with necromancy. So you probably already know this, but that word is much older than Tolkien. The word comes to us from Latin, but as with so many things, the ancient Romans got it from the ancient Greeks. In Greek, nekros means dead body, and manteia means divination. So, in the most literal sense, I guess it would mean seeking knowledge from the dead. However, in the modern era, when people talk about necromancers and necromancy, there's a high chance they're talking about something a little bit more sinister than simply asking questions of dead people. In a modern context, necromancy can simply refer to any kind of dark sorcery or black magic. And if we translate the words dark sorcery or black magic into Tolkien's Sindarin Elvish language, we'll find a word that I am certain you're all already familiar with. Dark sorcery is Morgul. Morgul. And to an extent, I think we can imagine a necromancer as being a person who uses this Morgul for their own evil agenda. But does that mean then that all necromancy in Middle-earth is inherently evil? Well, on the one hand, yes, Morgul is, by definition, evil. But if we go back to our earlier definition, is communicating with the dead inherently evil? Well, to answer that, let's move on to our second definition. What exactly does death mean? I'm aware that in our real world there are all kinds of medical and legal definitions of death that are not relevant to this video, but within the lore of Middle-earth, this question actually has a surprisingly straightforward answer. Published in a book called Morgoth's Ring, we will find a fascinating philosophical debate between the ultra-amazing, immortal Finrod Felagund, my joint favourite elf, and a mortal wise woman called Undreth. And during their dialogue, they say a huge number of fascinating things about death and deathlessness, and they share their perspectives on mortality and immortality. All elves and men and dwarves have Fëa, spirits, sort of like souls, which are made by Ilúvatar using his mysterious power of creation known as the Flame Imperishable or the Secret Fire. And all elves, men, and dwarves also have a Hroa, bodies, like incarnate forms, which are made from the fabric of Arda, from the world. And in Tolkien's writings, death is simply defined as the separation of one's Fëa, their spirit, from their Hroa, their body. When a mortal Hroa grows old, think men and dwarves, their Fëa will eventually be severed from it, and they will die of old age. Same if they sicken or starve or are slain. However, elves, who are immortal, don't grow old. They don't sicken, and they probably, it's ambiguous, but probably can't starve. Yet they can still die. If their Hroa is destroyed somehow, for example in battle, their Fëa will depart it, and although that Fëa will continue to exist within Arda, it won't depart the circles of the world like a man's Fëa, they are still dead. To paraphrase my guy, Finrod Felagund, what is death but the severing of these two, Fear from Hroar? And what is deathlessness but that the two should remain united forever? So, if we go with the earlier definition of necromancy, one could argue a necromancer in Middle-earth is anyone who manipulates spirits, Fear, without their corresponding bodies, or extracts spirits from their bodies, or traps unhoused spirits within new bodies. This is a bit different from how necromancy works in some other fantasy stories. You know, there's no like raising of zombies or anything, but understanding this definition is, I think, crucial in understanding how Sauron and other evil beings operate within Tolkien's legendarium. And perhaps the clearest and most obvious example of this Middle-earth necromancy is what the hobbits encounter in The Lord of the Rings when they venture onto the Barrow-downs. We are explicitly told the barrow-wights of that region were evil spirits that animated the corpses of the dead. However, the nature of these spirits does remain mysterious. We could speculate that maybe these spirits were dark lesser Maya that were somehow bound or perhaps willingly inhabited the bones of the long-dead men in this region. And if that is the case, it's very interesting, and it certainly would count as dark sorcery. It's definitely Morgul. But I guess it's not quite necromancy in the strictest Tolkienian sense. These evil Maya don't have Fear and Hroar. They are simply evil spirits of shadow, and their existence works quite differently from incarnate beings such as elves, men, and dwarves. However, we could also speculate that the barrow-wights are not corrupted Maya inhabiting dead bones. Instead, they might be the spirits, the Fear, of either dead orcs or fallen Avari elves, or even, perhaps, evil men. If there was some mortal man who served Sauron, or maybe the Witch King, in the early Third Age, and then died, had his spirit separated from his body, it's possible that that spirit was so dominated by the Dark Lord, it was forced to linger in Middle-earth instead of journeying west like other Fear do. And if that severed Fear was doomed to abide around the Barrow-downs, if they stirred the long-dead bones within those mounds and possessed them, that really is the most literal example of Middle-earth necromancy. But there's still more to it, because whatever the exact nature of the barrow-wight spirits, we can say with certainty that they are connected to the power of Sauron, or at least to the power of the Witch King. And we are told that although the original purpose of the barrow-wights was to prevent the Rangers of the Dunedain from resurrecting their lost realm of Cardolan and rebuilding the North Kingdom, much like Ents, the barrow-wights are not always active. They need to be roused. And in Tolkien's The Hunt for the Ring, which can be found in the Unfinished Tales, we are told that the Witch King himself spent 3 days at the Barrow-downs before the hobbits arrived there, awakening and empowering the wights that haunt them. Again, we get very few details, but we can be certain the Witch King definitely did do something that made the wights as potent and powerful as they were a couple of days later when the hobbits encountered them. And that something was almost certainly an example of necromancy. And much later in The Lord of the Rings, we will find a very different, but also seemingly very similar example of this kind of necromancy. After Frodo is stung by Shelob and carried by orcs to the Tower of Cirith Ungol, Sam Gamgee goes after him. And as he nears the gateway to the courtyard of that tower, he encounters 2 stone figures sitting upon stone thrones. On the one hand, these are statues, inanimate objects. There's no Hroar to speak of, but we are explicitly told these statues are aware, and within them abides some dreadful spirit of evil vigilance. They are known as the 2 Watchers, and despite being statues, they are able to, quote-unquote, see all creatures that approach the tower, even Sam while he's invisible with the One Ring. And not only can these spirit-infused slabs of stone watch for approaching enemies, they can also magically block people from passing them. Sam describes this barrier as if he's run into another of Shelob's webs, only this one is invisible. And as he tries to force his way through, some other will, too strong for his own, bars the way. As it goes, Sam is eventually able to make it past, but only with the aid of Galadriel's Starglass, and even then, the moment that light goes out, the Watchers magically reveal his presence by letting out a high, shrill cry, which alerts the orcs of the tower to an intruder. Again, as with most mysteries in Tolkien's writings, we could explain these statues as simply being inhabited by some unnamed lesser Maya, but in my opinion, if in doubt, it must be a Maya, isn't always the most interesting line of speculation. I would argue the two Watchers are considerably more sinister and frightening if, rather than just being some random and unknown Maya who's housed in stone, we think of them instead as being a product of necromancy. Maybe it's the Feyre of an evil man that's trapped inside these statues, or maybe the twisted, perverted, and corrupted Feyre of some unfortunate elf. Maybe it was an orc's Feyre, if orcs have Feyre, which is a controversial question in and of itself, and one that I go into a lot more detail on in this video. But maybe the dreadful spirit inside the Watchers was some servant of Sauron's who continues to serve him even after their Hroa has been destroyed. Or maybe the spirit was once an enemy of Sauron's that's been made dreadful by being trapped in there as some heinously awful punishment. There are loads of different ways of imagining these fascinating statues, but assuming they are not a Maya, I think all of them involve some sort of Middle-earth necromancy. Despite the obvious differences between them, they might be very similar to barrow-wights. They are inanimate objects, whether bone or stone, that originally belonged to the Dunedain, but was later occupied, or perhaps possessed, by a Hroaless Feyre bound to the service of Sauron. And there is another Middle-earth monster that also seems very different from a barrow-wight or a statue, but is potentially another example of this same kind of Morgul necromancy. In the First Age, Sauron was the lord of werewolves, and although in other stories, werewolves are usually thought of as shapeshifters who get hairy and then go crazy on a full moon, that's not how it works in Tolkien's writings. In the Grey Annals, we are told about creatures that walked in wolf shapes, and in the Silmarillion, werewolves are described as fell beasts inhabited by dreadful spirits that Sauron had imprisoned in their bodies. And dreadful spirit is, of course, the exact same wording that Tolkien used to describe what's inside the two Watchers. Even if the wolves themselves are never killed, I really think Sauron's misdeed of imprisoning spirits, presumably Feyre, inside wolf shapes would count as an act of necromancy, if we go by Tolkien's definition of death. We can imagine Sauron in the First Age magically extracting the Feyre out of some poor, corrupted, twisted elf, or perhaps a man, or perhaps an orc, and imprisoning it within the Hroa of a wolf. This kind of thing, I think, is exactly what makes Sauron a necromancer, imprisoning spirits and severing them from their original bodies, binding them in a Hroa of his choosing. Which raises another interesting question. Does that mean the act of creating orcs is also an example of necromancy? Well, I guess it depends entirely on how orcs are created and whether or not they have a Feyre. I'm afraid neither of those questions are easy to answer. Orc origins is one of the things Tolkien was most self-contradictory on. We'd be here all day if I tried to get to the bottom of that. But if we accept that they do have a corrupted, twisted Feyre, then I would argue, at least for those original orcs from whom the rest are descended, yes, they are made by necromancy. A Feyre was severed from its Hroa and used for malicious Morgul purpose. However, before I move on, there's something else from The Lord of the Rings that appears very ghostly and spooky, and I certainly feel it needs to be mentioned in a video about necromancy, but I would actually argue it's quite a bit different from the barrow-wights or the Two Watchers or the werewolves that I just mentioned. In the Two Towers, Frodo, Sam and Gollum enter the Dead Marshes, and there they encounter dead faces in the water. Now, in Peter Jackson's films, the Dead Marshes are explicitly shown to be haunted by scary spirits, and what we see there is pretty clearly at least adjacent to some kind of traditional necromancy. I think Peter Jackson probably took inspiration from the barrow-wight scene in the book when he adapted the scene for his films. However, in Tolkien's writings, the Dead Marshes are a lot more ambiguous. What Frodo and Sam see in the water are dead and rotting Hroa, killed in battle long ago. The Fëa of these dead warriors would have presumably travelled west thousands of years ago, or potentially lingered unhoused here in Middle-earth. But either way, they're not trapped in anything, they're not dominated by Sauron. This isn't really his necromancy at work. At least I don't think so. You might argue I'm straying far too far into semantics here, and maybe I am, but the Dead Marshes are potentially an example of Morgul, they're black magic, they're certainly spooky, but Tolkien leaves the whole thing really quite open to interpretation. Sam says to Gollum, "Well, the dead can't really be there. Is it some devilry hatched in the dark land?" To which Gollum replies, "Who knows? Smeagol doesn't know. You cannot reach them. You cannot touch them. We tried once, yes, precious, I tried once. But you cannot reach them, only shapes to see, not to touch." Which I think makes the dead faces really quite different from something like the barrow-wights. The shapes in the marshes are illusionary, intangible, and potentially nothing more than apparitions. They are associated with corpse candles, which might imply something magical is going on, but at the same time, corpse candles and will-o'-the-wisps are found all over real-world folklore, and I don't see much evidence to suggest that these bodies in the marshes have any ability to, affect the material world, and I don't think they have any real connection to Sauron, except that, they died thousands of years ago in one of his battles. But they don't even really seem to benefit the Dark Lord. Water is the domain of Ulmo, Sauron's enemy. Sauron never gains any kind of mastery over water, and we're explicitly told that his orcs go miles out of their way to avoid these marshes. This is not his territory. Despite their proximity to Mordor and, the foulness of their nature, I actually think the Dead Marshes represent more of a neutral no-man's land, which inconveniences Sauron, potentially with echoes of long-dead elvish magic, but not, I don't think, conventional necromancy. And of course, I use the phrase no man's land quite intentionally here because, from an out-of-universe perspective, the Dead Marshes are one of the only instances in any of Tolkien's writings where he took direct inspiration from his lived experiences of the trenches of the First World War. Dead faces lying in the mud is not a magical fantasy thing. It's something Tolkien and over 10 million other soldiers witnessed firsthand. Anyway, getting back to Middle-earth, a moment ago I mentioned that some Fëa may potentially linger as unhoused spirits in Middle-earth instead of heading west after being severed from their Hroa, in other words killed. And these houseless spirits are a really fascinating detail that we can read quite a lot about in an essay called Laws and Customs Among the Eldar. Tolkien tells us that when a Fëa leaves its Hroa, it isn't exactly brought to the halls of Mandos, it is summoned. And although the summons is imperative and it comes from just authority, it can still be refused. It's really more of an invitation, which any elf with a shred of wisdom should gladly accept, but no one is forced to, and some do not. In fact, in the earliest days of elvish existence, before Morgoth and Sauron really became aware of them, it wasn't infrequent for elves who died, presumably by accidental mishap, to remain as houseless, invisible spirits in Middle-earth, not too dissimilar from ghosts. However, when the Dark Lords rose to prominence, things became a lot more dangerous for these unbodied Fëa. If they encountered the shadow, one of two things would inevitably happen. Either they would flee in terror from the darkness to any refuge they could find, or if they were already committed to the darkness, they would pass into its dominion. If an unbodied Feyar refuses the summons of Mandos, if it doesn't go west, it has little power indeed to resist the counter-summons of Morgoth. And I would make the case that this counter-summons of Morgoth could represent the very earliest example of necromancy in Middle-earth's history. Even if orcs didn't exist yet, the idea that the Dark Lord could entice a Feyar away from Mandos and bring it into his dark dominion seems to be what Middle-earth necromancy is all about. But what if a regular elf hanging out in Middle-earth somehow encountered one of these unhoused elvish Feyar and communicated with it? Would that be necromancy? It pretty perfectly syncs up with, the ancient Greek definition of divining from the dead, but is it something that could happen in Middle-earth? Well, the answer to that is yes. But in that essay on elvish customs, we are expressly told that such a thing is forbidden, and also incredibly dangerous. Because some say that the houseless desire bodies, and the wicked among them will take bodies if they can, unlawfully. The peril of communicating with them is therefore not only the peril of being deluded by fantasies or lies, there is peril also of destruction. For one of the hungry houseless, if it is admitted to the friendship of the living, may seek to eject the Feyar from its body, and in the contest for mastery the body may be gravely injured even if it be not wrested from its rightful habitant. Or the houseless may plead for shelter, and if it is admitted, then it will seek to enslave its host and use both his will and his body for its own purpose. It is said that Sauron did these things and taught his followers how to achieve them. So there you go. Trying to befriend an unhoused Feyar runs the risk of getting your Hroa stolen, or at the very least significantly damaged. The author of these elvish laws and customs goes on to state, "It is therefore a foolish thing, besides being a wrong deed forbidden justly, if the living seek to commune with the unbodied, though the houseless may desire it, especially the most unworthy among them. For the unbodied wandering in the world are those who at least have refused the door of life and remain in regret and self-pity. Some are filled with bitterness, grievance, and envy. Some were enslaved by the Dark Lord and do his work still, though he himself is gone. They will not speak truth or wisdom. To call on them is folly. To attempt to master them and to make them servants of one's own will is wickedness. Such practices are of Morgoth, and the necromancers are of the host of Sauron, his servant." This essay is absolutely fascinating. It illuminates so many ideas that are only barely touched upon in other writings, but it is wholly concerned with elvish customs. Until that last sentence about the necromancers in the host of Sauron, we get next to no information about the potential for necromancy among men. And yet we know no elves ever served Sauron. If necromancers existed in his host, which they did, they must have belonged to the race of men. I suppose it's also possible they could be orcish necromancers, but if such a thing exists, they are never mentioned anywhere in any writings. However, in letter 131, possibly Tolkien's best letter, he wrote that during the Second Age, at a time when many men of Númenor fall under Sauron's dominion and become his servants, they carry their evil also to Middle-earth, and there become cruel and wicked lords of necromancy, slaying, and torment. So there we have it. At least during the Second Age, there were mortal men in Middle-earth who believed that Sauron was a god, Morgoth was their deliverer from death, and necromancy was a worthy pursuit of study. We can't know for sure what form this Second Age mannish necromancy might have taken, but I suppose the three most likely suggestions Or that maybe they found a way to commune with unhoused spirits and gain unnatural knowledge from them, or maybe they discovered techniques for elongating and stretching out their own lifespans, or maybe their necromancy was more in the realm of technology. The line between magic and applied science is pretty much invisible in Middle-earth, and so perhaps Sauron's necromancers studied sorcery, as modern scientists might study computing. We know that the mouth of Sauron was one such individual who learned great sorcery. Perhaps the other students of Morgul used their knowledge of necromancy to create the technology behind Morgul blades. Weapons that can bind their victims in the Wraith world. And speaking of wraiths, I guess it's finally time to talk about the Nazgûl. But to be honest, part of the reason why I wanted to make this video is to dispel a few misconceptions about the nature of the ringwraiths, and specifically the extent to which the Nazgûl are, or are not, dead. I think there's an idea among some fans, and let's be honest, this is because of the Hobbit films, that the Nazgûl are the ghosts or the undead spirits of dead men who've been raised from the dead by Sauron. He is a necromancer because he brought the Nine back to life. But that is absolute nonsense. It's kind of the complete opposite of what is actually the case. The Nazgûl didn't die and then come back as wraiths. The whole point is they never died. They are mortals. They should die. Their hroa has rotted and diminished and disappeared over the millennia. But because their feia are bound to their rings, they can't separate. They can't die. They simply fade into the wraith world. Even after their hroa has withered into unseen sinews, their feia cannot sever from it and go west. It belongs to the Lord of the Rings. I guess what I'm trying to say is the Nazgûl aren't, living dead. They're kind of the opposite. They are trapped in unending life. Life is unendurable to them, but they can't get out of it. Their feia cannot depart the circles of the world, as all mortals must, until the ruling ring that binds them all is destroyed. Which isn't to say the Nazgûl have nothing to do with necromancy, it's just a little bit more complex than what's sometimes presented. It's also a lot more ambiguous than we may like it to be. When I was putting this script together, I wanted to try and explain exactly how this hard link between hroa and feia works with the Nazgûl. But the truth is, it's just not that simple. Tolkien scholars have been debating this for a long time, and hard and fast answers still remain elusive. What we can say, though, is that roughly 4,800 years before The Lord of the Rings, in the Second Age, there was a mannish mortal baby born to, probably but not certainly, Númenórean parents. That baby grew up, and in time turned into quite an impressive specimen. We know very little about his early life, but Tolkien describes him as a great lord, a sorcerer, and a warrior. We know he fell under the sway of the Dark Lord, and so I'd argue this sorcery was probably an example of Sauronic necromancy, probably very similar to what the mouth of Sauron learned thousands of years later. But then, this mortal man, whose name has been lost to history, was gifted one of 9 rings of power. His ring allowed him to dwell in the unseen, in the wraith world. It let him gain even greater power and wealth. It stretched out his lifespan to an abhorrent degree until he was like butter scraped over far too much bread, and slowly it enslaved him. It bound his feia and his hroa to the dominion of Sauron, and over time he became known as the Lord of the Nazgûl, or the Witch King. He kept living, or perhaps I should say kept lingering, for many thousands of years, until his hroa had turned into nothing but unseen sinews that were knitted to his feia by dark spells. Until, in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Meriadoc Brandybuck plunged his barrow blade, a weapon forged by the Dunedain long ago during their wars with Angmar, into the back of the Witch King's knee, and this severed those unseen sinews from his will. Upon the fields of Pelennor, the Witch King, quote-unquote, died for the first time. His fear was finally severed from the near-nothingness that remained of his Hroa. And yet his fear could not pass on. It was bound to his ring, which was in turn bound to the ruling ring, which is in turn an extension of Sauron. We can't know this for sure, but I would speculate if the ruling ring hadn't fallen into the crack of doom 10 days later, Sauron would have eventually used his necromancy to somehow re-embody the Witch King and to bind his houseless Fëa into another physical form. Perhaps he would have been trapped inside a statue, like the Two Watchers. Perhaps he'd have been imprisoned inside an animal, like one of Sauron's werewolves. Or maybe he'd have acquired another mortal form that would eventually fade once again into unseen sinews. But the truth is that's all counterfactual. What actually happens is that the ruling ring is destroyed and the other rings that are bound by it lose their power. Finally, the ring wraiths are set free. Their Fëa depart Sauron's dominion and presumably return to Ilúvatar, to where they came from, as they should have done 4,000 years ago. So, perhaps contrary to popular belief, I would say that 8 of the 9 Nazgûl only ever died once in their entire existence, right at the end of it, like pretty much everyone else who dies. The Lord of the Nazgûl, the Witch King, he potentially died twice in the span of 10 days, which is quite embarrassing for him, but he was never raised from the dead using necromancy. Anyway, before I finish this video, I suppose there is one more group of wraiths who I really should mention. What about the dead men of Dunharrow? The Oathbreakers? Did Aragorn perform necromancy when he persuaded them to fight for him? Did Isildur when he cursed them? Are both the most recent High Kings of all Dunedain necromancers? Well, the answer to that is a definitive no. It might look like necromancy, but I would argue it's actually the complete opposite. Isildur did not bind anyone's Fëa like a necromancer might. All he did was communicate to the treacherous but living men of Dunharrow the doom that they had brought upon themselves. They used their free will to swear an oath, and they broke that oath with their free will. The story of the dead men is all about the nature and the power of oaths in Middle-earth and the consequences of oath breaking. It has nothing to do with necromancy. The men of Dunharrow, died in the sense that their Hroa diminished into dust after thousands of years, but their Fëa could not move on and depart until their oaths were fulfilled. And so, when Aragorn came along at the end of the Third Age and gave them the opportunity to do what they'd sworn to do at the end of the Second Age, he wasn't dominating anyone, he wasn't trapping any spirits inside anything, he wasn't binding them as a necromancer, he was setting them free. He was giving them the gift of death that their own actions had denied them for 3,000 years. Necromancers enslave Fëa, but Aragorn was their liberator. I really think his interaction with the dead men of Dunharrow makes Aragorn kind of like an anti-necromancer. They were stuck in a state of perpetual existence until Aragorn resolved it. If you like, he took the undead and he made them re-dead. He is, in that sense, I would say, the perfect opposite of Sauron. Now, I do want to reiterate one more time, magic in Tolkien's writings is always described in very vague terms, and there's always going to be potential for more speculating and more reinterpreting, and it is pretty hard to argue that any one perspective is, the correct one. But hopefully by examining the nature of death and dying in Middle-earth, as well as looking at a few examples, we can acquire a deeper understanding of Middle-earth necromancy, and we can kind of try to get our heads around what ideas Tolkien was trying to evoke when he described Sauron as a necromancer. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and if you did enjoy it, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.